Hello, I'm Glenn Forbes from the Robert Gordon University, and this talk is titled Wi-Fi Activity Recognition with Raspberry Pi. So, just to outline what I'll be covering today. First, I'll talk a little bit about our previous project, which leads us into this work. Then I'll cover the underlying technology that we're using in this project and some of the challenges around it. We'll then get into activity recognition and our approach, and how that might differ to some of the methods employed using other sensors. Then the details of the experiments we performed, and then what that can tell us. Our previous work was on the Fit Homes project, a community of 16 purpose-built smart houses, which functions as a testbed for health monitoring research. These homes are currently occupied, with most residents having some form of difficulty of mobility. These houses serve as an opportunity for these people to feel confident living independently. The houses themselves contain many simple infrared motion sensors, which we use to establish sequences of behavior as the resident moves throughout the house. Using our understanding of their behavior, we can build personal profiles which may indicate an increased risk of falling. By monitoring these profiles over time, we aim to establish trends in mobility which could highlight issues before the resident is ever clinically diagnosed with anything. Now, something that really makes this project stand out is that these sensors are completely ambient, ensuring that residents don't feel like they're under surveillance. Privacy concerns, as a result, are minimal, as our residents chose their sensors to blend into the environment. No cameras, no wearables, and no interaction on the residents' end at all. Now, for this project, we're trying to overcome the limitations that we face when using these ambient sensors. As researchers, we can see that many of the non-ambient sensor technologies, such as cameras and wearables, provide very rich data. And that data can be used for gait tracking, sleep monitoring, activity recognition, and far more. But the burden of the issue with privacy and inconvenience is then left with our residents, most of whom strongly object to these sensors. Infrared motion sensors, or most any event-based sensors, don't offer the same rich data, which means that we end up having to scale back our monitoring. Ultimately, we're looking to implement a form of ambient sensing technology which can still offer rich health monitoring potential. As a PhD student, I've spent a long time trying to find sensing technology which can do this. And this leads us into channel state information. It's a type of radio frequency sensing technology which we can employ using standard Wi-Fi hardware you can buy anywhere. Wi-Fi devices measure the quality of the signal between each other when they communicate, and with the right setup, we can use those measurements to visualize physical movements in the environment. The human body is largely composed of water, and so we're effectively opaque in radio frequency terms. This means that some of the most significant movements it's going to pick up are going to be human movements. Now, CSI data is made up of amplitude measurements from subcarriers, which are then sampled over time. In this diagram here, we can see CSI visualized in a heat map. And so from 0 to 10 seconds, I'm standing still. And then from 10 to 25 seconds, I'm waving my arms around before returning to normal. And we can see that in the heat map here, as the variability in our CSI measurements increases dramatically. You can also see the intensity of this changes across different subcarriers. Potentially, this data could be very rich. Now, while all Wi-Fi hardware could be capable of providing us with CSI, in practice, this isn't the case. Wi-Fi devices typically only output CSI data when using modified drivers, which limits us to very specific hardware and software configurations. The most popular of this has been the Intel IWL 5300, and most CSI research has been performed with it. Due to the age of the card, it's quite impractical to use it today, mostly due to the older Wi-Fi specification and no modern Linux support. What's worse is that it actually puts off quite a lot of people looking to work with CSI. However, thanks to a tool from Germany called Nexmon, CSI can now be extracted from more consumer devices than ever before. Most notably, the Raspberry Pi 4, which is one of the most popular computing devices in the world. Not only does it use a more modern Wi-Fi specification, but it's also supported in the very latest Linux kernel, and this makes it the cheapest and easiest way to work with and research CSI. So how easy is it to get started with CSI data? Well, I can show you some data of me sitting in my chair. We saw in the last diagram before that we have a time series matrix of amplitude values. And so if we select just one subcarrier, we have one value being monitored over time, just a 1D vector. So this value here looks quite noisy, and if we apply some outlier filtering, then we can already start to see an underlying signal in there. So let's go ahead and apply a running mean. and suddenly we have a signal. This signal right here shows the movement of my chest while I breathe in my chair. And it's really quite incredible to think that we can pick this up out of the air. It might not surprise you to hear that CSI research is mostly an engineering-based focus at the moment. And this means that most of the tools for working with this data are written in MATLAB, which limits the appeal a little bit. As part of my recent work, I've made a simple-to-use Python framework for data scientists to get started with CSI. It's available at the link below. Consider giving it a shot yourself if you have a Raspberry Pi 4. So I've just given you one example of how CSI can be used, but this area of research is growing every day. This year alone, we're starting to see the first commercial implementations of CSI sensing. Linksys now offer movement detection as part of their top-of-the-line Wi-Fi routers this year. And in Narita Airport in Japan, back in March, they started using CSI for presence detection in their public showers instead of cameras. In research, we've seen estimation of vital signs such as breathing and heart rate. We've seen demonstrated sleep and posture monitoring solutions, which give more realistic data than ever before with no disturbance to subjects. We've even seen human identification being done with gait. This area of research gets me really excited, and I can't wait to see where we end up in a few years. So let's get back to what we're doing with the Raspberry Pi. Now, activity recognition is quite a diverse area, and in assisted living, we actually have quite a narrow focus. For us, this ambient sensing should allow residents to feel more comfortable living independently for longer. The term activities of daily living refers to many of the activities that we do in daily life, such as bathing, food preparation, getting dressed, etc. By monitoring the performance of these ADLs, we can keep track of a resident's independent capability. This is a real problem in assisted living, as residents aren't actually likely to accurately tell us if they're struggling. And unfortunately, motion sensors alone cannot give us all of this information. By using CSI for activity recognition, we could potentially get real insight onto our residents' ADL performances. Now, as with all activity recognition, how we segment and split up our data can completely reframe the problem. We chose to split up our CSI data into 1-second windows, and there are some clear pros and cons to this approach. On the one hand, it's a very simple solution which is tried and tested, and it can make a lot of sense when it comes to data distribution for machine learning, as there are good opportunities for windows to contain partial and overlapping activity samples, which, on paper, should produce a higher quality model. However, it isn't truly representative of the CSI data we would observe if we were running this real-time system. And residents are also unlikely to all perform activities in the same average length of time. So with the precision offered by CSI data, deciding how to window the data is still a challenge we're really considering. Regardless, once we've got windowed data, we do need a classification model too. Now, most of the existing CSI research makes use of feature engineering based on their observations in the data, or through algorithmic approaches such as principal component analysis, before then passing that to a standard classifier such as SVM. And this approach is valid. However, what we tend to find is that these methods don't produce robust models. Unfortunately, the patterns in CSI data are largely dependent on the environment, which is to say that a model which can work in any environment is actually quite unlikely. Instead, we're interested in reducing the domain knowledge needed to build these models, using deep learning for both feature extraction and classification. As in the diagram before, we've been able to manually observe the patterns in our CSI data. Surely we should be able to learn those features from our data algorithmically. Our chosen model structure is our deep convolutional LSTM. Our input vectors are 100 by 256 by 1 windows, which means that we have 1 second of CSI data containing samples for 256 subcarriers. We're then using two 1D convolutional layers in order to perform feature extraction from this data. As with that first diagram, some subcarriers are much more responsive than others, so we're aiming to select those which are most relevant to each given activity sample. This is then passed along to two sequential bidirectional LSTM layers, which are well suited to time series classification. What's notable here is that we've actually observed a clear improvement in performance when using bidirectional layers as compared to standard LSTMs. Now, moving on to the experimental setup. Our activities were performed alone in my small apartment. As I'm sure you can understand, we're short on options at the moment. The good news is that this is a fairly representative environment, given that we're interested in real homes that people are living in. Environmental clutter, RF interference, building density, it all has an effect on the quality of our CSI data. There has been some research in this area, but we don't know the full extent of this currently. This also comes into question when we look at our activities. These are performed in different rooms, which splits them into two major categories. Those performed with line of sight to our CSI device and non-line of sight. And those without line of sight would be expected to be more difficult to classify since the signals have to propagate through walls. We picked a fairly large set of activities, aiming to cover sort of anything which would be useful in regards to in-home health monitoring. But ideally, in a deployed solution, we would make use of smaller subsets of activities which could be flexible and personalized to a specific resident. For our model, we used two CNN layers for our feature extraction stage with 128 filters and two bidirectional LSTM layers of 200 units, implemented in TensorFlow. This was run for 200 epochs, and tenfold cross-validation was used with a 70-30 train-test split. This leads us to our experimental results. And so first of all, our model did show strong activity recognition performance in these experiments, with 92% accuracy across all 11 activity classes. This gives us similar performance to feature-based systems, while only making use of raw CSI data with no pre-processing. This demonstrates that the Raspberry Pi 4 indeed can be used for CSI activity recognition. Now, drilling down into some of the problem spots, we're seeing weaker than normal performance in activities which are similar to one another, and most notably, that's with the chair-based activities, stand up and sit down. On these activities, accuracy drops to around 65%. Potentially pre-processing could offer some relief within this area, but that wasn't something we were considering in these experiments. We're also seeing some drops in performance, looking at fairly different activities, being pet cat and cooking and into bed. These activities all occur in different rooms, different heights, and in all honesty seem like really different activities. Now, there is some class imbalance with less samples associated with pet cat because, unfortunately, they don't cooperate in our experiments. However, they also potentially contain similar arm movements, and as cooking and into bed are non-line of sight activities, potentially the intensity of the movements that is observed is actually quite similar to that of pet cat due to the distance fall off. Additionally, we also wanted to identify whether a Pi-based CSI system could use the existing Wi-Fi infrastructure already inside our Fit homes. And by downsampling our CSI data to 10 Hz, we've simulated the ambient network traffic which is already generated by the Wi-Fi routers in our houses. Comparing performance between our standard results, we observed largely similar performance, which is a great result. We've also observed minor reductions in performance in those chair-based activities that we had issues with before, but we're still seeing roughly 60% accuracy in both. This proves that this solution is a viable option to use the existing infrastructure in our houses, which reduces equipment costs and e-waste. So where are we going from here? Our key area of interest is identifying issues which affect the commercial viability of this kind of solution. First of all, we're interested in optimizing our data representation for CSI. By not pre-processing our data, we were able to reduce computation. However, it's likely that these models will perform better using pre-processed data. Furthermore, our model structure is not fully optimized and potentially could benefit from treating our CSI differently, such as 2D spectrograph images. We're also interested in improving segmentation with a targeted solution using statistical values in our CSI. By considering the variability of CSI data, we can observe movement and lack of movement independently, and this would allow us to segment our data based on periods of movement, eliminating any overlap or partial activity samples. We're particularly excited about this approach. Finally, there are still many challenges we face in considering real-time deployment for these devices, beyond just the simulation I've discussed. Computational requirements are a large factor in how complex we can make our models, as is overhead for pre-processing and sort of a few other factors that all compound in real time. So to conclude, we've demonstrated that the Raspberry Pi 4 can be used for activity recognition with CSI data, which drastically reduces the cost of this kind of solution. Furthermore, our deep conv LSTM is a suitable approach, and other options are available too. Activities with no line of sight also tend to increase our model's confusion. However, the low cost of this solution means that we could aim to place one device in each room. And finally, the existing Wi-Fi infrastructure in the home can actually be used to reduce costs and e-waste. Thank you for your time.